In the forests of the American Midwest stand enormous earthworks, some over 100 feet tall and hundreds of feet wide. When American settlers first encountered them in the 1800s, they were baffled. Who had built them? Many refused to believe Native Americans were responsible. Instead, they invented theories about a lost civilization. Around 1000 BC, in what is now Ohio, the Adena culture emerged. They lived in villages of circular houses with canonical roofs. They hunted, gathered wild plants, and fished local rivers. Archaeologists have uncovered intricate stone pipes and elaborate pottery. Their burial mounds were built layer by layer over generations, marking important members of society. These were not random piles of earth. They were the result of a structured and ceremonial culture. In 200 BC, the Hopa culture were around a similar area to the Adena, the state of Ohio, and some holdings further out west, raising corn, beans, squash, and other types of maize, but also relied on fishing, hunting, and foraging. It's believed the mounds that they made were either defensive or more likely burial grounds. Their pottery often featured designs of fish and birds. Archaeologists have also discovered obsidian from the Rocky Mountains and marine shells from the Gulf Coast and Hopewell burial sites, evidence of trade networks spanning thousands of miles. Many of their mounds are built as effigies like animals. The exact ceremonial purposes of these mounds are still debated today. The final mound builder culture, and likely the most notable, was the Mississippian culture, which flourished from 700 CE to the arrival of Europeans. They made their home in the Mississippi River Basin, but reached all around the U.S. states of the Midwest and South. Their main way of life was the cultivation of maize, beans, squash, and other North American crops. Their mounds are the chief's residence, one of the largest mounds being 700 feet wide and 100 feet high, which likely supported temples and elite residences. Monk Mounds at Cahokia remains the largest prehistoric earthwork in North America. Cahokia was the largest city north of Mexico. It may have held between 10,000 and 20,000 people at its peak, making it larger than many European cities at the same time. It also comprised 100 of these earth mounds. They also had significant advances in culture. However, the society declined due to environmental and social pressure, similarly to the Aztec or Maya. This wasn't one civilization, but a cultural tradition spanning some 2,000 years. They were a very impressive culture, which seemed to the American explorers that their works couldn't have been done by the natives, as it was supposedly too grand for them. So, they came up with their own theories. The myth started when English settlers first discovered the mounds. The Spanish had discovered the mounds first in the 16th century, but after they had already seen the Maya, Aztec, and Inca civilizations, they had no qualms believing the natives could have built them. The English settlers, however, before even discovering the mounds, were convinced that the natives were the descendants of the Canaanites from the Bible. By the time English settlers had discovered many of the mounds, native populations in those regions had already been devastated by disease. When settlers asked local tribes who had built the mounds, some groups simply didn't know. The cultures that had built them, the Adena, Hopewell, and Mississippian, had all vanished centuries earlier. To European settlers, the mounds appeared to have no owners, and that made it easy to invent a lost civilization. Even scholars of the time bought into it, and gave the theory a false sense of legitimacy. Some believed the builders were one of the lost tribes of Israel. Others claimed it was the civilization of Atlantis. Without real evidence, they pointed to various cultures, but rarely considered the possibility that Native Americans had built them. Yet there was no evidence that Europeans had reached the Americas before Columbus. and built such a civilization. Despite this, many settlers claimed the Native Americans had destroyed the supposed lost civilization. As Americans expanded westward, this idea was used to justify removing the native peoples from their lands. Some even made up fabricated stones to try to prove this myth, supposedly discovered by David Wyrick, who had tried to prove that one of the lost tribes of Israel had lived with the natives and built the mounds. This is believed today to be a forgery. This false belief of one of the lost tribes of Israel being the true builders of the mounds also came from their biblical beliefs. The false belief allowed for the justification of the religious element of manifest destiny. It didn't help that many of the immigrants coming into the country from Eastern and Southern Europe were Catholics. Another popular myth within the 19th century being that people thought it was giants. And with the New York Times newspaper in 1897 describing a 9-foot skeleton being discovered in Wisconsin. However, these were later described as being fabrications, and later being debunked by the Smithsonian, and no legitimate skeletons were ever found. With the New York Times story exaggerating the claims, America in the 19th century tried to use this myth to justify removing the natives from the West. According to them, they weren't displacing the native peoples of the land. To them, they were reclaiming the land with this lost civilization. This myth wasn't created overnight. It was the result of 2 centuries of pseudoscience and racist thinking. It pushed the myth of the noble savage, or that they had believed the natives' way of life was less civilized than their own, and the result of westward expansion would give them Western civilization. If Native Americans had built these massive earthworks, it would have shattered the 19th century belief that they were primitive. Rather than revise their whole worldview, many chose to invent a vanished civilization instead. So the myth had also justified their worldview. In their eyes, the natives being uncivilized, and that they had to civilize them. This idea of civilizing the natives is the ideology that contributed to the policies that devastated native populations. Later, in 1894, the Smithsonian put an end to the lost civilization myth surrounding the Moundbuilders. They debunked the idea that it was anything other than the ancestors of the tribes in the area. They did it through the process of proving that the cultural pieces on their works were unmistakably native, not from any other culture. They also examined the remains of nearly 3,000 individuals buried in the mounds, which were deemed to be natives. They determined that the remains matched known Native American skeletal traits and burial practices, and that the artifacts found within the mounds were consistent with indigenous cultural traits. There was also the accounts of the Spanish conquistador, Hernando de Soto, who discovered the Mississippi on one of his expeditions in the Americas. There, he met the Lady of Cofetachiqui, who ruled there, and told him that the mounds were burial grounds for their nobles. There was also a French artist who went with French settlers to Florida and produced watercolor paintings of the natives practicing their way of life. While many of the original copies were lost in the 16th century, the Flemish had made copies of some of them. There were also the accounts of the chief paramount of the Natchez, who, similarly to the stone pipes talked of earlier, Natchez would sit at the top of the mound, which was his residence, and smoke tobacco in the 4 directions. They were sun worshippers. After this discovery, the myth was dispelled by academic circles, which the myth had lay prevalent before, even there. While this theory of a lost civilization of mound builders had caught on, it was harder to dispel it. And as people expanded westward, and many got rid of the mounds and tried to destroy the evidence of these great mound builders. And many people still bought into the myth during the 1950s. This is because of the fact county histories of the time, well into the 1950s, talked about this mythical lost civilization, and attributed to them the people who built the mounds. Even still, myths surrounding the Adena, Hopewell, and Mississippi persist even today. Both Eurocentrists and Afrocentrists of the modern day have described that the Native Americans didn't build the mounds. Even news reporter Tucker Carlson talked about the myth on his show, when a caller said that he doesn't think the Adena, Hopewell, or Mississippi built them. Carlson agreed with the caller. Another example comes from the hit TV show Ancient Aliens, which follows the usual pattern of claiming that civilizations must have had extraterrestrial help, despite a complete lack of archaeological evidence. The overarching theme with the myths about the Mississippi, Hopewell, and Adena, both of today and those of the 19th century, is that these cultures weren't advanced enough to create the earth mounds, and they advanced their own political agenda, to the detriment of the true mound builders. Overall, the Adena, Hopewell, and Mississippi were impressive cultures and civilizations, and Americans in the 19th century tried to claim their achievements were done by a fictional, lost white civilization, and claimed the ancestors of the natives had destroyed them, and tried to justify removing them from the landmass. Yet the myths surrounding the mounds still persist today, in conspiracy theories, political narratives, and pseudo-historical claims. All the while, the real history is attempted to be played off as something it isn't, because it's convenient for many different political movements. That concludes the myth about the mound builders. Thank you for watching.